Today, Stu is going to has reviewed this session's bills that were of interest to us, and is going to take us through those and Stu, I'll leave it up to you to decide if you want people to interrupt during or wait till the end. But with that, I'll turn it over to Stu Flashman.
Okay, thank you, Rick, and all of you. Thank you for attending. I'm going to be going through some of the bills that have been in the legislature this session, just the 2024 part of it, not 2023. Those bills that made it out in 2023, I'm not going to deal with. Those were dealt with last year. But the session, as you know, the legislature is still in session, or maybe you don't. But the committee's hearings are all done. So the only thing that's left is for things to be taken up by the floor of the two houses. And that's going to be, for the most part, bills that have already been passed out of one house and are now getting a final vote from the other house. And sad to say, for a lot of these bills, that last vote is probably going to be a formality. With the Democrats having a supermajority of more than 2/3, and with most of the Democrats working and moving in lockstep with the legislative leadership, it's unusual for a bill that has gotten as far as we are now to not get approved. Every once in a while, there'll be a bill that raises enough hackles on enough people and enough groups that some legislators will change their mind, and the bill will usually narrowly go down to defeat on that last vote. But it's very unusual. So when I show you bills and says all this is awaiting is a final vote in its final house, you can probably expect that bill's going to pass and will become law. Unless the other possibility is, once these bills are passed out of the legislature, the governor still has to sign them. So there's always the possibility of the governor vetoing a bill. Again, with a Democratic governor and a Democratic supermajority in the Senate, the legislative leadership usually working very closely with the governor, it would be really unusual for the governor to veto a bill that the legislature passed. And if he does that, this year, the most likely reason for that is the budget deficit. We've had an enormous budget deficit. That has been the biggest single factor resulting in bills being killed. And in fact, the majority of the bills that were killed, well, I shouldn't say the majority, but a lot of the bills that were killed in one of the two appropriations committee, the Senate or Assembly Association Committee. And those, when bills are killed there, they aren't actually killed. They're basically what they say, they're held in suspense. But when you're held in suspense and you don't get to a final vote of the full legislature, then you're effectively killed. And those reasons for those bills being killed is, for the most part, they would require expenditures, and the Appropriations Committee said, no, we can't really afford that. So there are a lot of bills that would have fiscal impacts that got knocked out that way. And I'll go through those in detail. But let me start with saying one thing that happened, and has unfortunately in the last few years happened very often in the last few weeks of the legislative session. And those are what are called gut and amend bills. That's when the Senate or Assembly leadership decides there's something they want to take up and get passed. And so they grab a bill, usually with the approval of the bill's sponsor, but potentially not, and they amend it so that it eliminates the entire body of what that bill had been and replaces it by something entirely different. And needless to say, those bills go directly to the floor of the two houses, don't go through any of the committees. There's very little opportunity for public input. It is one of the worst features of the legislature that has not yet been totally eliminated. There's been efforts over the last probably 10 years or so to make it less and less likely that happens. And the Senate and Assembly rules now are supposed to keep this from happening, but it still happens. And what I wanted to bring to your attention is a package of bills, and let me put that up here. Let me find it here. Here we go. So this is a letter that got sent to the legislative leadership. And you can see from this first page, which is, they call these NASCAR bills, or NASCAR letters, because they have insignias of a huge number of organizations all on there, basically saying all of these organizations are supporting this letter and asking the legislature to do something or not do something. And if you look down here, back in the, let's see, what is it, the sixth row is Livable, California. So we signed on to this letter. It's a letter that was sent to the full legislative leadership. And let me see if I can. Yeah, here we go. This is the actual letter. It was written by a couple of groups, but then they were working with other groups that sort of helped draft it, and then it was sent around for sign on in Livable, California. And this basically had to do with a group of 5 bills that were all going to be gut and amend efforts. They were all going to be bills that had been stripped out of their provisions and plugged in new ones. Those bills have not yet formally been introduced, but they have been written, and we've been able to get a hold of the draft versions of them. And it's basically a bunch of bills that would, for what are called clean energy projects, that would streamline the process of approving them, and in some cases eliminate any CEQA review of those projects. And if we go back to that first page, you can see that a lot of these groups that signed on here are environmental groups, but there were other groups as well. And it's primarily people who are upset about basically eliminating the thoughtful process of approving a bill, like, which in a lot of cases is the environmental impact report. When you have a big project and you do an environmental impact report, it will point out, or at least should point out, issues that might not be obvious on first appearance. And those impacts can be tremendously important. For example, a project might impinge on habitat for an endangered species, might damage or block a wildlife migration corridor, might have a very damaging effect on greenhouse gas emissions, even though clean energy is supposedly going to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. There are lots of ways in which a project can damage things on the environmental side. And basically what this is saying is this rush to push through these projects is not wise. And it's something we will probably regret in the years to come if this package of bills gets put through. So it's urging the legislature, don't do these last minute gut and amend, especially for issues that are this important. They need to go through the full legislative process and bring it back next year. It's not that long, not that far away. And we need to have the sort of thoughtful discussion that happens in the legislative committees. So we're hoping that this letter will have its intended effect and get the legislative leadership to back off of this gut and amend package. But that's a last minute effort that we're involved in. A lot of other groups are too, and we're hoping it'll be successful. But let me move now to the main focus of this meeting. Excuse me, I got a little bit of bronchitis, so you'll have to pardon my occasional coughs. There were lots and lots of bills, as there are every session, and a lot of those bills didn't go anywhere. We aren't going to talk about any of those bills. Most of the bills we're going to talk about were either eliminated somewhere, usually late in the process. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of those bills were eliminated because of their potential fiscal impact. So, if you will, both for the pluses and the minuses, we can thank the deficit for the fact that some of these bills did not get approved. But a lot of them are going to be, and as you see from this list, a lot of these bills, they'll say pending final assembly vote or pending final Senate vote. That means it's almost done. And as I said, that final vote is usually no more than a formality. But one can always hope. And we have certainly sent letters to express our opposition to bills we're opposed to, or to express our support for bills that we think should go through. But we can't guarantee that anything will happen at this late date. So I'm going to be going through them. What I've started off with, I'm going through the Senate bills first, and I'm starting off with a group of 5 bills. Four bills that were all authored by Senator Wiener. As most of you probably know, he is our, what you might call the bête noire, the horrible beast that lurks there, and every session puts through bills that do damaging things. And for the most part, we've been unable to stop him. But we have stopped at least one of those bills, and that was SB 610. This was a bill that would would modify the process that is now used to identify high fire risk areas. And that's a very important process because when an area is in a particularly very high fire risk area, it puts restrictions on what can be built there. And that makes a lot of sense because you don't want to put a lot of housing, particularly multifamily housing, in an area that's at high risk of having a wildfire. We really don't need any more paradise situations where a whole city gets destroyed. And this is basically that mapping and designation of very high fire risk areas is what keeps that sort of situation. It's supposed to keep those sort of situations from happening. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than and particularly when you look at this bill's sponsors with California Building Industry Association, YIMBY Action, and the Housing Action Coalitions, all groups that are pushing very hard to put housing everywhere. These groups would love to be able to put housing developments and maybe even whole cities in high fire risk areas. Thankfully, the Assembly Appropriations Committee held this bill and it died. And we joined a lot of different groups, including not only a lot of environmental groups, but the League of California Cities and the California's, that's the county association. CSAC is the corresponding association of counties. And those bills, both the League of California Cities and the Association of California Counties opposed this bill. And that hopefully helped to get it held in the Assembly Appropriations, and it died. However, the other 3 Wiener bills, one of them is an amendment to the Coastal Act's provision as it applies particularly to San Francisco. Another one that would require Caltrans to include what's called complete streets components in all Caltrans projects. That means facilities for bicycle and pedestrian access. And the third one that's likely going to get approved is a bill to further enforce compliance with all of the laws affecting housing elements in general plans and other housing laws, and particularly blanking on the name. Anyways, these laws that all are having the effect these days of pushing more and more housing down the throats of local cities. This bill, SB 1037, which was sponsored by the Attorney General, would allow the Attorney General or a Housing Community Developments Department of the state to come in and force a city to do something with the threat of severe fines hanging over their heads. So these 3 bills that remain are all pretty bad bills. We have tried to oppose those bills and convince the legislature to at least reduce the damage. And for SB 951, for example, the original bill would have totally removed the California coastal area in San Francisco from the coastal zone, would totally eliminate coastal commission jurisdiction over that area. Would have been horrible. And it would have been an extremely bad precedent, because then, hey, if San Francisco can do it, we should be able to too. So you can imagine this emasculating the coastal commission. Thankfully, we're able to get that bill modified. So it's still a damaging bill, but not anywhere near as bad as it could have been. Likewise, the bill for putting complete streets components into all Caltrans projects, you can imagine, what does it mean, excuse me, if you're going to have pedestrian bike lanes on freeways? Number one, it's going to be extremely costly. Number two, it's likely going to be extremely dangerous, because when you have accidents happen in the freeway, or you need the breakdown lane to put those accidents in. What if that breakdown lane is also a pedestrian lane? You can imagine people have in a panic as they're having an accident happen, swerving over into the breakdown lane and hitting pedestrians or bicyclists. So we got that bill modified so it eliminates any Caltrans projects that involve highways that do not allow pedestrian bicycle access. So thankful, at least the major freeways will not be affected by this bill. But other freeways, like for example 101 north of San Francisco, even though it's a freeway, it does allow pedestrian bicycle access. This bill is going to make them have to do more pedestrian and bicycle access. It's going to be very costly. It's also going to be potentially dangerous. But as I say, it's not likely that bill's going to get stopped, because it's only has one vote left. It'll probably pass. Possibly because it'll be very expensive, the governor may veto it from the budget standpoint. That's our last hope. And the housing bill, we got rid of some of the worst provisions of this bill, but it's still a very bad bill. Moving on to other Senate bills, SB 7 was a bill which would basically, for the most damaging part of this bill, would be that where the housing community development directly sets RHNA goals for a city or a county, because they aren't in one of the regional groups, like the Bay Area group, or the LA area group, or the San Diego group. There are a number of these regions where that regional group sets the RHNA goals for cities. This bill would not have much effect on those, pretty minor, but in areas which are not part of one of those regional groups, this bill would basically say local agencies do not have any ability to object to the RHNA goals that HCD sets for them. We think that's a bad bill. We have tried to modify it a little bit, and we've been partially successful. It's still a real bad bill. It's likely to get approved. SB 393 by Glazer is a bill that involves challenges to housing projects. And as it now stands, this bill is actually not such a bad bill. It's still not a great bill, but it's not as bad as it was originally. Originally, for example, one of the things it would have required is that if you're doing litigation to oppose a project, you would have to disclose all of the groups and individuals that are helping to support that litigation financially. That would be extremely bad, and frankly would interfere with the right of privacy that people have in terms of trying to be involved in litigation. This would basically say you don't have a right of privacy anymore. We were able, directly talking to the author and his staff, to eliminate those provisions of the bill. It's not a great bill, but it's a lot better than it could have been. The SB 440 is from Skinner, and this is allowing regional housing finances agencies. There is already one in the Bay Area. There's already one in LA. Excuse me. This would expand those provisions to apply statewide. We think it's not a wise bill. It's going to require a duplication of efforts in many cases, and we are opposing it, but it's likely to pass. SB 450 is one that people may be quite interested in. This involves SB 9. You may recall this is a bill that would allow up to eight housing units to be built on a single lot, because it would first allow you to build 2 units on a single lot, and second, it would allow you to subdivide those lots so that you would get 2 lots out of one, and third, it will allow multiple ADUs on each of those lots that resulted. So it would put a lot of housing in, and the issue is that none of that housing is necessarily affordable. There was a trial court ruling earlier this year that said because this relied on findings that we needed more affordable housing, and because the bill didn't do anything directly to require affordable housing, it said that at least as far as charter cities were concerned, this bill violated the Constitution, and so it invalidated the bill. That was only in the LA area. It went up on appeal. It is now up on appeal. If the appeal court upheld that decision, it would basically say that charter cities throughout California would not be subject to SB 9. Atkins now has come back with a bill that amends the findings for SB 9 so that it's no longer requiring affordable housing. It's no longer aimed at specifically affordable housing. It's basically now saying, the findings say, well, we have a housing shortage. We need to build more housing everywhere of all sorts. And therefore, anything that helps build more housing is going to help this statewide issue. And that would overrule the trial court decision on SB 9. The SB 9 with these modifications would no longer be unconstitutional, at least under that trial court ruling. So it's not great. It's pretty damaging, especially for any places that we're hoping to be able to stop SB 9 from adding more housing in places where it doesn't belong. But it's likely this is going to pass. SB 689 by Blakespeare would allow conversion of roadways in coastal zones to pedestrian or bicycle lanes without any traffic study, and with only with approval by under the local coastal plan for a de minimis amendment to the coastal plan, so long as the Coastal Commission's executive director makes certain findings. That process, that thing about the Coastal Commission still being involved and the executive director being able to say, hold on, you've got to make some findings before you do this. That was not in the original bill. The original bill would have eliminated Coastal Commission's jurisdiction entirely over these type of projects. We and other groups opposed that and got it modified so that at least the Coastal Commission still has a say. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's a lot better. And this one has already fully passed the legislature and it's awaiting the governor's signature, which is almost certainly going to happen. So again, it's a bad bill, but it would have been a lot worse. Let's see this. Oh dear. For some reason, the bill number has gotten eliminated here, but this was a bill by Caballero, that requires a study of whether the vehicle miles traveled criterion for transportation is effective in identifying significant impacts and the mitigation for those impacts under CEQA. The change from looking at levels of service to looking at vehicle miles traveled was done unilaterally by the legislature, I think about 8 or 9 years ago. It has now been in effect for all these 8 or 9 years. Nobody has ever looked at how good is this vehicle miles traveled in actually eliminating major transportation impacts and forcing them to be mitigated. This would do that. We've supported it, and it's awaiting a final assembly vote, so we cross our fingers and hope this will get approved and go into law, and we will finally get a good study of what exactly is this change from level of service to vehicle miles traveled. Is that having a good effect or a bad effect on transportation impacts? SB 827 was another bill that we supported, and which looks like it will probably pass. And this would establish an Office of the Inspector General and the BART to investigate and audit BART operations. I'm sure that many of you have been aware of the fact that BART has problems, lots of problems. And Senator Glazer had already pushed to have 2 audits by the state audit committee of the legislature. This would produce a permanent position to audit and to evaluate how BART is running. We think it's a good bill, and we're hoping it's going to pass. SB 1077, this is basically was originally going to just blanket allow ADUs in the coastal zone, regardless of, and illuminate the potential for the Coastal Commission to have any effect on ADUs. And basically it would override the Coastal Act in terms of ADUs. It's been changed. So now it's going to require the Coastal Commission's involvement to develop guidelines. And we think that will be helpful. And so while we oppose the bill, we are much less opposed to this final version, because the Coastal Commission is going to be able to develop guidelines, and hopefully will be thoughtful in terms of keeping ADUs out of areas where they're sensitive areas and ADUs just don't belong. Finally, SB 1159 by Dodd, that would have exempted roadside vegetation management plans from CEQA review, just a wipeout exemption. We think this would have been a bad idea, because while roadside vegetation management plans are probably in general beneficial in terms of reducing the likelihood of a wildfire spreading into a roadside area, the areas that are necessary for evacuation of forest areas like a Paradise. But there are also important environmental effects in those roadside areas. I mean, this was going to be an area alongside roads where you would basically be allowed to wipe them clear of any vegetation, and that could have damaging effects, particularly if you're talking about endangered species or other important aspects of environmental aspects. So this one again was held, and this one again in the Appropriations Committee, because of the estimate as to how costly this bill would have been to implement. So a bad bill that was blocked based on budgetary rather than environmental impacts. So that's the Senate bills. That's not all of the bills, anything close to all of the bills, but it's the bills that we thought had the most potential damage. We got a few of them blocked, but a lot of them have gone through. Going on to the Assembly, are there any questions on all the Senate bills? Okay, well, I know we've got people muted. If you wanted to raise your hand, maybe Rick, you can look and see if there are any hands raised. I can't see the whole group.
I did raise a hand here.
Okay, go ahead, Frank.
Yes, the Atkins bill, is that to override the decision that was a result of the 5 charter cities in Southern California?
That's correct. That's exactly what this is aimed at.
Oh,
is overriding that decision.
She's overriding a court decision, and the appeal hasn't even been heard yet.
That's right. But what this would do is it would moot the appeal. It would say the law is no longer the same. The decision, the trial court decision, was based on the fact that there was an inconsistency between the law and the constitutional provision protecting charter cities. As modified, the bill would no longer have the same problem, because of essentially what the trial court says. Well, this bill is supposed to be about housing, affordable housing, but it doesn't do anything about affordable housing. So it doesn't justify overriding the rights of charter cities. Well, now the new amendments to the findings, legislative findings, say we're concerned about overall housing, not just affordable housing. And so we're saying that there is an issue about overall housing production throughout the state, and that's a statewide issue of significance, and therefore we can put this bill through even if it doesn't do anything about affordable housing. So if this bill passes, that trial court decision will be mooted.
Okay, has Pam Lee commented on that legislation at all?
I don't know. I don't know all of the background on it.
Okay.
Like I say, the bill is SB 450. You can look on Ledge Info to find out the various
I will.
committee results and the committee reports and who's opposed and who supported the bill. As I say, we opposed it. I think a lot of other groups opposed it, but with the Senate, with Atkins behind it and support of the legislative leadership, it just rolled on through.
Yeah, she's got a huge conflict of interest. You know, her partner is in the housing business.
Right.
She's writing legislation for her partner.
Yeah,
Corruption runs amok.
you know, the legislature has lots of problems, and one of the biggest problems is the fact that when the legislature wrote up conflict of interest laws, they, to a large extent, exempted the legislature from those laws.
Yeah, well, that may be litigated one day too.
Yeah. Anyway, so moving
you.
on from there, unless there are other questions.
There's two more
Yes,
hands
there
up.
are.
Oh, sure.
Stu.
Libby,
Libby
go
and
ahead.
then Susan Kirsch.
Yeah.
And this may be Susan's question. Is this list available, like, or could you send me a link to this?
I think what we'll try and do is
Or
put
is it
it
on
up
the
we'll
website?
put it up. It's not up yet. I just finished it last night. So
Okay, because I wanted to report out to Catalyst, so.
yeah,
this would be
Rick, are we going to be able to put this up on the website?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay,
okay, thank you.
sure. Susan? You're muted.
Okay, Libby, that was a great question. Thank you for asking that. I do actually have a different question. And I'm wondering, Stu, I mean, in the midst of all of the excellent reporting that you've done, do you think Skinner's bill, Senate Bill 440, might that be influenced by the fact that Regional Measure 4, the bond measure to give funding to the Bay Area regional formation, will that make any difference on this vote?
It's probably not. I mean, because look, the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency is already existing. Yes, it tried to put a bond measure on, and I think what they found was the polling said this measure is going to go down to defeat, and so they pulled the measure. And I think that what that says is, for the time being, that's likely to be the case with any bond measure that one of these agencies puts on the ballot. But that's right now the situation, but it may not stay that situation. I'm sure that all the people who are involved in the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency are hoping that the situation, fiscal situation for the state and for the economy will improve such that people will no longer worry about having another bond measure on the ballot. And so I suspect this will go through anyhow.
Thank you.
Holly?
Yes, I'm just gonna pick a bill, SB 440, you say it's pending final assembly vote.
Correct.
Well, if it's pending a final assembly vote, if it's modified, doesn't it have to go back to the Senate as well? I'm just
If it's modified, but this bill is pretty much final as it stands right
well,
now.
what about 450, that Atkins abortion?
That one again, I think that was put through quickly. I'm not sure whether it went through both houses or whether it was not originally written to do what it's now doing, because it didn't change they obviously amended it to address the trial court decision on SB 9.
Well, I'm just reminding people, if it's gonna go back to the Senate, that's another set of people we should
Yeah, but you have to realize this is only going to go to the full Senate for concurrence in the Assembly. In other words, it won't go through any of the Senate committees.
I understand that. Thank you.
So it's yes, it is one last shot. If this would not have to look back in the history of the bill to see where it got modified and whether in fact it was modified after it already passed the Senate, in which case you're right, it will have to go back to the Senate. But the likelihood is, and particularly with the leadership supporting it, it's just going to roll on through.
Yeah, I think our lobbyists have said that they can't remember when a bill was changed in concurrence and not concurred with. So I don't give that trip back to the other house any hope as far as I'm
Yeah,
concerned. But
the one situation that did happen a couple of years ago, and Rick, you may remember this, there was a bill that had been modified in the second house, and there was a big fight over getting it through that second house, and it got stalled, and it didn't get final approval until I think it was something like a quarter to midnight, 12, 15 minutes before midnight on the final day of the session, and it didn't have time to get back to the other house for concurrence.
SB 1170.
Yeah, and the time ran out, and that's the only situation. That's the only bill I can think of in recent memory where that happened.
Joan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just have a question on it. Senate Bill 7, SB 7, Blakespeare. Oh, what does that mean for areas where HCD directly sets local RENA goals?
So there are these groups of cities for each of the major urban areas and for some of the not so major urban areas.
Right.
But and those groups are the agency that actually sets the goals for individual cities in that group, and each of those regional agencies has the ability to raise issues with HCD and say, hey, HCD, you didn't think about this, or this, you should have done it this way. And HCD has to consider, but doesn't have to approve, and almost always rejects those. But it does mean that there's at least officially some way to address HCD's determinations. For these areas that we're talking about here, these are areas that are not in any of the major urban areas, and those cities and counties, HCD directly identifies what the goals for those cities and counties is, and essentially what this bill says, you don't have any recourse. If HCD says you got to do it.
I'm confused. So I'm in Southern California. I live in Palos Verdes. SCAG is the one who oversees our community.
Okay, so SCAG has the ability to raise objections with HCD.
With HCD.
Individual cities don't, but SCAG does.
All right. So SCAG can overrule what our
Not
city.
overrule. HCD can raise objections. I mean, SCAG can raise objections to HCD, and if HCD agrees with those objections, it can say, "Oh, you're right. We did this wrong. We'll change it."
But HCD aside, Stu, I think the issue is individual cities don't have the right to appeal to HCD.
Correct.
But they do have the right to appeal to SCAG or ABAG or
right.
The
right. But again, almost all of those appeals are also turned down.
Right. But
so
the appeal right still exists.
Yeah, it's a process that is pretty futile, but nevertheless, it's still there. And in theory, a city could raise an issue with SCAG, for example, and say, you did this wrong. We want it redone. And SCAG could say, okay, you're right. We did this wrong. We're going to change it. But the individual cities don't have any ability to go directly to HCD and say your overall process was wrong. SCAG would, but not.
Can you give me a real example? So let's say a city sends up its plans to HCD and it gets approved, and SCAG could say, well, no, you didn't comply with this and this. Is that what you mean?
There are two different things. There's a housing element and there's the RENA goals.
Right.
And the housing element has to address the RENA goals and explain how that city is going to meet its RENA goals.
Right.
The RENA goals get set before the housing element approval. Each cycle has a set of RENA goals. Those are set before the housing element for that period is finalized. So it's setting the RENA goals is an early step in the process. Approving the housing element and having HCD agree that the housing element is adequate, that's kind of the last step. The RENA goals were set much earlier than that.
And just real fast, does it have anything to do with this, like Senate Bill 610 and building in high fire zones? I thought it did, but I didn't.
The RENA goals, the way things work with 610 and the high fire zones is that the current law says that you're not supposed to put high density housing in areas that are very high fire zone, very high fire risk. You're not supposed to do that. And so consequently, the RENA goals and the general plan housing elements are supposed to leave those areas without high density housing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, 610 would have modified that.
Okay.
David?
I'm a little confused here just because I know, and I live in LA, and
Mhm.
you know, we have our community plans and our general plan get overhauled on over time, and I don't understand how the requirement for the RENA fulfillment gets
Yeah,
built
so
into.
yeah, that I think I understand what you're wondering about is what's the relationship between the the general plan, the community plans, and the RENA goals.
Right, and how it gets implemented. You know, in the plans.
Yeah. So let me
Within the period of the RENA period.
Yeah, so there are two separate things that go on in general plans. General plans are supposed to get periodically reviewed and amended or modified or rewritten, but there's no specific deadline for that, no specific timeline for that, except the housing element. And the housing element has to be overhauled and rewritten for each new RENA goal period. And so what happens then is that the HCD sets RENA goals for the region. The region then divvies up those RENA goals to individual cities and counties, and since here's your goals, and those then have to be incorporated into the housing element for that next round for the RENA. So in other words,
so I have a question here, which is, does that mean that housing goals get built in to the housing element and the general plan, regardless of what the other considerations are that wouldn't come up until?
Well, there are. So the housing goals are supposed to have to be met by the housing element. Now, when the housing element gets approved, one of the implementations for the housing element is to make various amendments to the general plan and zoning to accommodate the housing element's decisions on where we're going to put housing.
Yeah.
So for example, generally what happens is that the housing element gets approved, and then the various elements of the other elements of the general plan, if necessary, get modified to comply and to be consistent with the housing element. Okay, and that would go down to the community plans, where if the housing element says you got to put so much housing in this part of LA, the community plan for that part of LA would have to be modified to be able to put that housing there.
Yeah, so housing is in the driver's seat.
Housing is definitely in the driver's seat. That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
Vicky?
I have a question for you. You know, in Mount Shasta, we have a very low RENA figure. We only required 2 housing units. However, we have a very proactive, rather YIMBY city manager and a city manager system and planning director. And he is stating they actually have just passed in final reading of an exclusion of all multifamily resident housing to be ministerial. It doesn't matter if it's market rate.
Wait, I'm confused. Are you saying that multifamily housing can be automatically approved ministerially?
Exactly. And he is.
And is it all over for the entire city?
Yes, and he is arguing that is the state mandate that HC.
Well, the state mandate under SB 9 is that you have to allow at least 4 units, at least 2 units per parcel, and each parcel can be subdivided into 2 units, into 2 parcels. And then you can also put ADUs in, and all of that under SB 9 is ministerial.
Right, I understand that, but they have actually, I think, preempted Wiener to make all multifamily housing units, all development ministerial, and it
And that could be, they may have, I mean, you have to realize the RENA numbers and all of that regulation by HCD is a floor, not a ceiling. If some city wants to go further than that in terms of how much density they allow and where they allow it, they can do that. Now, they would have to do CEQA analysis and CEQA review. So, for example, if the city is putting through a plan that says we can put as much multifamily housing as we want, anywhere we want, and it's all ministerial, no more discretion, that act of passing that law, that local ordinance, would have to go through CEQA review.
exactly. So one of my colleagues who's very knowledgeable on CEQA for 40 years actually argued that it should go through CEQA because of that very reason. And they were told it was not required, that this was actually a state mandate.
It's the state mandate is SB 9 is a state mandate.
Right.
And but to say you're allowed to do multifamily housing anywhere without any discretion, that's not any sort of state mandate. That's wrong. If someone's saying that, they're misunderstanding what the state rule laws are.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Barbara?
Thank you. Thanks for the information. I wanted to comment on something David Ewing said, and that is that in many cities, or at least in Los Angeles, the city is attempting to do the community plans at exactly the same time that the housing element is being finalized. And that is a precarious situation for us, because when we do our community plan, we think we know what we're doing and what we're establishing as maximums, for example, and density levels, but the housing element will trump the community plan. So I am suggesting, and if anyone is here from LA, I'm suggesting that we all act together and say to the planning department in the city that the community plans have to be on hold until after the housing element maps have been completed and turned in February, because it's only then that we'll know what our baseline really is.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I mean, I live in Oakland, and Oakland got its RENA goals, wrote up a housing element, and they had zoning to go along with it, and they thought they had something that was okay, and they sent it into HCD, and HCD said, no, you got to change this, you've got to add more density here and more density there, and that, and essentially the city said, yes, sir. And they went ahead and made all those changes. And now they're having to go back and change all of the general plan elements and the zoning to comply with what the housing element is now saying.
Right, that's exactly it. And at least with
but
LA,
there's no other, the thing about it is that if you don't have, if you have to do them kind of in coordination, because if you've got a housing element that says we're going to put this much housing here, but the community plan doesn't allow that much housing, HCD will say, well, you can't do this. Your community plan is inconsistent with your housing element, so we're not going to accept your housing element.
Right,
but not going to accept your housing element until the community plans show that you can do what your housing element says you're going to do.
Well, we have an approved housing element. Now we're mapping to create the zoning to meet the numerical goals, but then it will be up to the community plans to actually enable that to happen. But if we do the community plan and think we've got a plan done, and suddenly there are overlays created citywide by the housing element, and there are pressures now to upzone all R1 lots, period, citywide. That's what Abundant Housing, the YIMBY affiliate here, is doing. Then our community plan is basically meaningless.
And you're going to have to redo it. That's right. That's right. And essentially, what would happen would be if you're a community, well, and this is an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to this because there is a law, there's a state law that says that all of the elements of the general plan have to be consistent. And if you do something to one part of the general plan that is inconsistent with another part of the general plan, that part that when you approve that part that's inconsistent, that is invalid. That approval is invalid because the general plan has to be internally consistent. And the community plans are part of the general plan. They are a sort of subunit of the general plan. And consequently, if anything in a community plan is inconsistent with other parts of the general plan that are already approved, that is invalid until it's made consistent.
Well, I just think we should be taking a timeout until the housing element mapping is done. And by raising the other question about general plan, other elements, I don't know if other cities are in a similar situation, but our open space element hasn't been rewritten for years and years and years and years. And it absolutely does not accommodate to provide open space for all of the new density that's being zoned. And I wonder if that's a good discussion for us to have here in the
It might be
future.
an interesting issue, and the issue would be whether having your open space element not provide sufficient open space to meet the open space requirements created by the high density housing. But you know, the thing about a lot of the general plan policies, and this is done intentionally, is a lot of the general plan policies say should.
Yeah.
And if they say should, they can whatever, you know, you can't be inconsistent with a should. If it says shall, then you could have a problem with inconsistency, which is why planning departments generally don't like to put shalls in.
Thank you.
So we're getting a little bit of far afield, but I think it's all relevant to what we're talking about here. So let me go on back to where we were on the assembly bills. AB 1333 would have been a good bill. It would have prohibited the bundling of properties for sale purchase. And there were two bills, we'll talk about both of them. But it basically, because what's been happening is these large corporations have been buying up single family houses and converting them to rental units. And now they are basically creating I guess you would call it an oligopoly, where a few large real estate firms control thousands and thousands of units of housing and can set the prices for those wherever they feel like it. And for a lot of cities, even if they have rent control laws, those rent control laws often don't apply to single family houses. So essentially, this is a loophole where these corporations get to raise the rents on single family homes to ridiculous levels. This bill would have said you can't keep doing that, but it died in the Senate Policy Committee. The housing industry has a humongous lobbying power. They give humongous donations to candidates, and so the housing industry has a lot of say in what passes through the legislature. And I would be willing to bet that when this died in Senate Policy Committee, if you looked at the people who voted against it, you would find they were all getting lots of money from the housing industry. But again, the legislature said, no, that's not a conflict of interest. You can get lots and lots of donations from an industry, and it doesn't affect your ability for voting for or against, or even voting on legislation affecting that industry. So it's one of the weaknesses of our system. AB 1782 was when we supported, and it did get enacted. So what this does is says if most of you may remember that there used to be redevelopment agencies, and Governor Brown eliminated the redevelopment agencies, but he allowed a successor agency to continue working on projects that had already been part of redevelopment plans, had already had funding. And so there were each of those cities or where there was a redevelopment agency, usually the city council would be designated as the successor agency, and that agent and the city council then would have access to those funds. What this does is it says, well, you can take some of those funds and use them for low and moderate income housing. even if they weren't originally designated for low and moderate income housing. We think that was a good idea. And that did get enacted. So that will now work. It says that redevelopment funds that formerly were in a redevelopment agency, some of those funds beyond what was originally proposed can be used for building and maintaining low and moderate income housing. 1840 by Arambella. This is a home purchase assistance program. We thought that was a good idea. We want to encourage people to be able to get home ownership, particularly first-time homeowners, and that is awaiting final Senate vote. AB 1868 by Friedman. This one basically says if you're building affordable housing, and let's say that's affordable housing for sale, that affordable housing, the funds that were used to help build that in a loan to build affordable housing, those don't become part of the basis. They don't go into the property tax assessment. And so it basically saying if you get a loan to build affordable housing, you don't have to end up adding that onto the cost of the housing in terms of property tax. So in a way, it's an indirect subsidy for affordable housing. And we think it was a good idea, and that again is waiting final approval by the Senate. This AB 1881 by Davia, it was originally going to propose that the Coastal Commission had to have a member with, quote, building expertise, which is to say somebody either from a labor union or from a real estate company. We thought that was not really a good thing. It frankly creates a conflict of interest for people on the Coastal Commission. That got changed to say you need to have, instead of a building expert, you need to have an erosion expert. We think that's an excellent idea. So we went from opposing the bill to supporting it, and that has been enacted as modified. So we think that was we took a bad bill and made it into a good bill. AB 1886 by Alvarez. This is a bill we opposed. It's again the Housing Accountability Act. Excuse me, has become a real scary thing, a monster essentially, and this would make it even more of a monster. We opposed it. It's awaiting a final vote. It's probably going to enact it. The Housing Accountability Act will be even worse. And likewise for AB 1893 by Wicks, again, it was going to narrow what local agency findings would be necessary to avoid being attacked under the Housing Accountability Act. Again, we oppose that. It's probably going to pass. AB 1951, you remember there was the Wiener bill for vegetation management plans. This was a similar, although broader bill for vegetation management plans. We opposed it and it died in the Assembly Policy Committee. So we helped, in that case, helped to kill a bad bill. 2023, there's another bill to tighten the provisions of Housing Accountability Act. We opposed it, but it's probably going to get enacted. So the Housing Accountability Act continues to get worse and worse. It's getting to be more and more draconian in terms of what housing developers can go after cities if they turn down their housing project. Again, it's part of the general theme of the legislature to preempt local control of housing decisions. 2043 by Wicks would require approval of projects containing a certain amount of affordable housing, essentially making the approval of those projects ministerial. We opposed it, but again, that's waiting a final Senate vote. Again, you can see a theme here. The legislature is stepping in more and more often and overriding the local agency's ability to decide what gets approved. And on the basic theme of, well, if it will help provide affordable housing, you've got to do it. We're not giving you any choice. I spelled Carrillo wrong. That's with 2 L's, not 3. 2485 would provide for RHNA process reforms for the next RHNA cycle. We wish they could have been done earlier, but we definitely support reforms to the RHNA process so it'll work better and do what it's supposed to do. And particularly one of the things that's a real problem with the RHNA process right now is, as any of you who are involved in city government know, cities can approve housing, but they can't make it get built. And the RENA process right now, in terms of how it ties into all of these Housing Accountability Act and other, particularly Wiener bills, is saying, no, you've got to actually build the housing. Well, cities don't build housing, the developers do. And you can approve all the housing you want. If the city won't, if the developers won't build it, you can't meet your RENA goals, and therefore you are all subject to all kinds of nasty stuff. Again, we think that the reform should have happened before now. Maybe it'll happen with this bill. Maybe it'll happen in time for the next cycle. It may be too late, but nevertheless, better late than never. 2498 by Zabur would provide funding to address housing insecurity. Housing insecurity means people who are about to drop out of the bottom of the Housing Act. They are people who are about to become homeless. And we think this was a good thing, but unfortunately, it died in the Senate Appropriations money. With the deficit, they said this is too expensive, can't do it. 2560 by Alvarez. It would have required approval of density bonus projects in the coastal zone so long as there was no significant impact on coastal resources. Well, how do you determine that? Particularly if density bonus projects are often being exempted from CEQA. We opposed it. Thankfully, it died in Senate Appropriations, so that bill at least isn't going to happen. 2584 by Lee. Again, this was like the earlier revision bill we talked about, would have prohibited business entities from acquiring over 1,000 homes. We supported it. It died in the Senate Policy Committee. Thank you, real estate industry. 2712 by Friedman. This was originally a pretty bad bill. It was going to allow, it was going to allow multifamily housing near transit to get residential parking permits, even in spite of that. We opposed it. The bill was modified and by the author, and it finally says it's going to have restrictions on residential permit parking on multifamily housing near transit. This is basically, if you're near transit and you're from multifamily housing, don't expect you're going to be able to get a residential parking permit for on-street parking. You're supposed to put your car in the parking that goes along with that project.
That was the intent, but it's now exempting smaller projects and it exempts low-income projects.
Yeah, and the idea is those aren't going to have a big impact, and the low-income projects. Those are people who maybe can't afford. Remember, we also have unbundled parking. So if you can afford the unit, but you can't afford the associated parking space because you're low income, then maybe you should be allowed to get a residential permit. Yeah, Sheila? Sheila, rather.
Yes, hi, Stu. Yes, Barbara and I were behind this bill. Unfortunately, Laura Friedman changed it. So the low income and the smaller 20 unit buildings are exempt from this. The problem is in LA, we got Executive Directive 1, which is Karen Bass's, executive directive, allowing 100% low income to be built on one parcel. And so basically in my neighborhood, we have a 200 unit coming on 3 parcels that would be basically exempted by this bill. They could get as many parking permits as, so they basically made this bill toothless a little bit. But anyway,
well,
we're still great.
Yeah. It's better than, it's certainly a lot better than it was.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, for low income housing, number one, the hope is that, particularly if they're near transit, low-income people are the people who are most likely to use transit. That the studies show that, yes, the people who use transit most are the low-income people. So maybe they're going to be less likely to want to get an on-street parking permit, because with on-street parking permits still require, usually they cost money. And if you're not going to be able to have a car, then maybe you don't have the money for the parking permit either. The idea is, if you're low income, you're more likely to be using transit. You're less likely to be having cars that need about parking spaces. The smaller projects, the argument there is basically these aren't going to have a big impact one way or the other. It's the 400 and 500 unit projects that create huge problems for a neighborhood, not a 20-unit project.
Yeah, that doesn't hold in our neighborhoods, but
Okay.
okay. Yeah,
Anyways,
anyway,
that's-
we
think,
we were the
we
first one.
tried to get changes. We got some changes. They weren't enough, but at least it's better than it was.
It's better than nothing. Yes, I agree. Thank you.
2835 by Gabriel. This was a shelter program for motels and hotels. We supported that. We think that this would basically be putting homeless people into motels and hotels and with support so that they could get them off the streets. And that's on the governor's desk. We'll have to see what happens with it. The problem is it's going to cost money, and it's possible the governor will veto it because it's costing money. But we think it's a good program. 2898 by Carrillo. This exempt subsidized housing units from requiring unbundled parking. We think that makes sense. If you're in a subsidized housing, you may not be able to afford that bundled parking. Maybe the parking should go along with the unit. If you can afford the unit. And the other thing about this is for subsidized housing, if it's, for example, Section 8, you're talking about the cost for the unit. If the parking is included in the unit, then Section 8 helps you to pay for the parking as well. Whereas if it's separate, you might not be able to pay for the parking. And now what are you going to do? You've got your subsidized unit, but no place to park your car. So we thought it was a good bill. We'll have to see what happens with it in the final vote, but it's likely it will pass. 3122 by Calera. This is requiring ministerial approval for affordable housing. The bill modifies existing laws. It would weaken the standards for ministerial approval of a project with affordable housing. It would basically reduce how much affordable housing such projects have to get ministerial approval. We think it's watering down the program of ministerial approval of affordable housing, making it less effective. We opposed it, but it's awaiting a final vote. And that's the last of our measures that we looked at. So we will be coming up, once the session is finished, we'll be coming up with a report card for each individual legislature to see how they voted on the important bills. And we won't be we're looking at all of these bills. That would be too much work. We're going to try and probably identify the 10 most important Senate bills and 10 most important Assembly bills and see how people voted and use that to rate them.